Welcome to Unrestrained, the podcast series from CPI. Here you can enjoy conversations where professionals on all sides of crisis and behavior management relax and open up about themselves, their workplace, and their clients. You'll get the latest tips and trends from the best in the business, so tune in often to integrate their experiences with your own. Hello and welcome to Unrestrained, the CPI podcast series. This is your host, Terry Vittone, and today I'm joined by Reece Peterson and Elizabeth Kane from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Hello and welcome, Reece and Elizabeth.
Hello. Hello and welcome.
Hello. Our interview today is with two subject matter experts in the field of crisis intervention training programs and the use of restraint and seclusion in schools, and our interview will center on those topics. Before we begin, let me give you some background on our guests. Reece L. Peterson is an emeritus professor of special education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, specializing in the education of students with emotional or behavioral disorders. His interests include intervention for students with behavioral needs, student discipline in school, school violence prevention, as well as special education policy. He is an author of a book and several articles on the use of physical restraint and seclusion procedures in schools. He testified before the U.S. House of Representatives as hearings as an expert witness on this topic in 2009, and Reece has also directed a national research project on school violence prevention. Elizabeth J. Kane is a doctoral candidate in school psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She has received training in two different models of crisis intervention and has authored several articles on the use of physical restraint and seclusion procedures in schools. She has helped to design a study of crisis intervention training and has served as an expert witness on the topic of safe use of physical restraint for a case pertaining to students with disabilities who had experienced undocumented and unreported physical injuries and abuse. Okay, let's begin. Reece, your teaching and research is focused on violence prevention, intervention, and addressing the needs of students with emotional behavioral disorders in school settings. Over the past 10 years, you have focused much of your research on the use of crisis intervention procedures and specifically the use of physical restraint and seclusion procedures in schools. Could you begin our interview today by explaining why you chose to focus on crisis intervention and physical restraint and seclusion procedures?
Yes, amazingly, it was really a great deal of circumstance that resulted that way. I had a doctoral student I was working with, who is now Dr. Joe Ryan at Clemson University. He did a student paper on the topic of crisis intervention and physical restraint and seclusion procedures. That resulted in us attending a conference at Cornell University several years ago. And what we discovered is that there were very few people who had done any examination or research about the use of crisis intervention in school settings. Almost all of the work that had been done in residential treatment centers or hospitals or even with adults. So as a result, he and I continued to work in that area and began to be involved in research with several other people as well. And as a result of that, when the federal law was being proposed that related to the use of these procedures in school settings, I think that's how I happened to get called upon for that hearing. So it wasn't planful, but obviously this fits within the broader issue of violence in schools, as well as the idea of sometimes these procedures have been used as a disciplinary response in schools. So that's kind of the background.
So you're really a trailblazer in the pedagogical research of crisis intervention in schools.
Yes, at least as it relates to schools. Many others have done work in other areas.
Right, okay. Now, in 2009, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan called for all states and school districts to examine their policies on the use of restraint procedures in schools in order to prevent abusive situations. Could you describe his initiative and talk about if it has had a meaningful impact on legislation and action in schools?
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, and most people know, there have been no federal laws passed that relate to the use of physical restraint or seclusion or crisis intervention in schools. Although several of these bills have been proposed over the years. And at the time that these bills were being proposed, Secretary at the time, Arne Duncan of Education at the U.S. Department of Education, came out with what was called a guidance document for schools. And that guidance document contained 15 principles that schools should consider in their use of these procedures. And at that time, Secretary Duncan recommended that schools develop their own policies in accord with these 15 principles. So right now, that guidance, even though it has been quite a while since it was published, remains the only real federal guidance on this topic at that level. And that probably has stimulated a lot of state policy development.
Well, that leads to my next question. I mean, do you feel that that document has influenced states' individual policies on restraint and seclusion, and maybe helped them to standardize their approach to restraint, seclusion, and crisis intervention? Do they not vary as greatly, or perhaps is there more awareness than there was in 2009?
I think yes, that has promoted the development of these state policies. And actually, there have been a couple of fairly recent studies of these policies. According to, there was a group, Marks and Baker did a study. They say 38 states now have existing legislation and 45 have policy on restraint and seclusion. So, and I'm not sure how many of those states had policies prior, but I would suspect that most all of these states that now have policies were stimulated in part by the federal initiative and Arne Duncan's guidance document. In terms of standardization, they do have many of the components that Secretary Duncan recommended, but there are also other components that are not frequently included in these policies. So they do vary considerably in terms of their contents as to whether they actually embody all of the components that Secretary Duncan had recommended.
Yeah, I think the Marks and Baker, they looked at it and found that there's some of the principles that are commonly addressed, such as imminent danger, the need for it to be an emergency use procedures, but other ones are really not being covered often, such as reviewing and updating policies. So it just kind of depends. And I think something that we have found is that even when these components are addressed, there's just a lot of variance in how much detail or guidance is provided across states. So there's definitely, I think we're not seeing standardization in that aspect.
I see. Any feel for the impact that this legislation and this awareness has caused since 2009? I mean, do you feel that there is an appreciable difference in the? I mean, this is I guess is a difficult judgment to make, especially without an evidence-based study. But what's the feel out there? I mean, when you talk to people.
Well, it is hard to read that. On the one hand, the level of discussion about these topics has diminished, in part perhaps because in the states that have policies, they feel that the policy is at the state level is addressing it. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's continues to be these incidents occurring and often reported in the media where these procedures are used either abusively or without adequate supervision and the like, resulting in injuries to kids and others. And those situations that are reported in the media often don't seem to be in compliance with what we would expect policies to cover. So it's kind of a mixed bag there. Certainly it's a good thing, I think, that these states have policies, but it is also not the solution.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Well said.
And in fact, this Marks and Baker study, and I can forward that link to you, even indicated that local districts, there doesn't seem to be a pattern in the local districts that are having difficulty being only in the states that don't have policies. In fact, it seems to be a mixed bag. Even with policies, there are districts that are having trouble. And on the other hand, in states that don't have policies, there are districts that seem to be doing a really good job.
So awareness and effectiveness is kind of scattershot then, and there doesn't seem to be maybe a consistent coming to form or an understanding of these principles and procedures that might happen if, say, for instance, some meaningful federal legislation was enacted.
I think that's true. The scattershot notion is probably accurate. And it could be facilitated by federal legislation, but it remains to be seen. I think a lot of this probably does boil down to what happens at the local level and whether alert administrators are aware of these issues and provide adequate training and supervision.
So I see. Well, and something that might begin to raise their awareness of it is something like your 2010 journal article of a review of crisis intervention training program for schools, in which you write the number of students with serious behavior issues who are served in general school settings has increased dramatically. And you go on to write that, quote, ineffective educational programming, for example, failure to provide appropriate curricular, instructional, and or behavioral interventions may exacerbate the behavioral difficulties of some students, leading to a vicious cycle of antecedents that set the stage for problem behavior, end quote. So really, leading back to the scattershot thing, do you think that this vicious cycle has been diminished, if not, probably not broken as we see, but is there a rising tide of awareness that you sense out there? I guess that's a difficult question, but a fair one, I think.
Yes, it is difficult. And I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. Certainly there's more awareness than there was 5 or 10 years ago. And people do recognize the problem, that this is a problem area when kids are being injured and so on. On the other hand, it surprises me continuously that there's a lack of awareness in some districts and that people seem just kind of oblivious to the dangers that are involved with both not intervening as well as intervening with kids in this way.
And do you feel that when you write the number of students with serious behavioral issues who serve in general school settings has increased dramatically, do you feel that that is more of an awareness and a reporting issue, or do you feel that's a societal issue and sort of the fallout from other cultural things that are sort of creating these behavioral issues?
Well, I think we're more aware of kids with behavioral needs and the varieties of behavioral needs that these youngsters may have, and also I think there's data that the mental health needs of kids is increasing. So there's more kids with more serious difficulties and in these behavioral areas, and those kids are also being served more frequently in public school settings, whereas they may have been sent to day or residential treatment programs in the past. So I definitely believe that there is more demand, more problems in these areas than in the past. And as a result, many schools are moving to do a better job of the use of physical restraint and seclusion and their overall crisis intervention. But on the other hand, not all schools are keeping up with those kinds of things.
Now, also in your 2010 journal article, which we will provide a link to, a review of crisis intervention training programs for schools, and I believe that this is really the first journal article of its kind focusing on crisis intervention training in schools, so certainly a groundbreaking article. It provides in-depth comparison of CPI and 12 of our competitors, and you compare aspects of these programs, the purpose of the program, terminology used, components of training, time allotted for each training component, training and certification research requirements, types of program offers, and instructional strategies incorporated within training. You go on to write that, quote, One of the most significant differences among the programs had to do with the relative emphasis placed on restraints versus crisis antecedents and conflict de-escalation, end quote. Can you elaborate on these differences, and do you feel the programs have become more similar in their focus on de-escalation and restraint, specifically as a last resort?
I'll have Elizabeth respond to that. She was heavily involved in that study.
Well, so this is actually, so what we did was we have a more recent updated version of this study that has not been published yet, but we've presented on it several times, and we can also send you the links to that. But I think both in that previous study and this one, what we're really referring to is the amount of time that's in training that's spent on these different training components. I think that overall there's a pretty consistent focus or understanding that crisis de-escalation is really important, and that prevention should be a focus and is important, and that restraint should be reduced. But I think there is a difference on how programs are approaching this. And so some programs are spending more time on crisis de-escalation and identifying antecedents, whereas others are spending more time on making sure that focusing on practicing the restraint procedures. And we have talked about a lot that although we talk about in these articles how much time is spent on these different procedures, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're spending more time on restraint, that you're promoting its use, because these procedures carry a lot of risk. So it's important that staff are trained on understanding the risks of them, how to understand the situation, how to appropriately intervene safely. So, and just for an update on that more recent study, we looked, and across the programs, about 41% on average of time in training is spent on crisis de-escalation, and about 21% of the time on average is spent on restraint. So there's definitely a greater emphasis on crisis de-escalation, but restraint is the second component.
And that holds across all of the different training programs that are offered.
Mm-hmm. Just for instance, like across the programs for crisis de-escalation, anywhere from 20 to 60% of their time in training is focused on crisis de-escalation. And then for restraint, it's anywhere from 8 to 50% of their time in training is focused on those procedures.
And I should mention that all of the data for this more current study is available on our website, so we can provide that link as well.
Why don't you tell us the link right now, and we'll also print it in the article.
Okay. I think it is K12 Engagement.unl.edu.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Nicely done.
Yes. And then there's a behavior and discipline tab, and at the bottom of that there's physical restraint and seclusion.
And that
Excellent.
will lead you, I believe, to some slide sets, a variety of resource materials, the information about the current study, and so on.
Yep. So there's a button there that says Crisis Intervention Training Program Study, and that's the one where you'll get the data.
And there are pie charts for each individual training program, all 17 of the ones that responded to our study that are there. So you can compare side by side each of these different programs in terms of how they responded as to how they emphasize their training time.
So are you finding, since the first 2010 article in this update, that the programs more diverge or agree with each other, would you say?
It's hard to tell because the studies were a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that they are maybe coming together to focus on prevention more than they did in the past, and probably also more on de-escalation than in the past.
Yep. And as I would say, as I said, I think that there's definitely that shared emphasis, and it might not always come across in the pie charts because, as I said, just because you're spending more time on restraint topic doesn't mean that during that process you're not emphasizing that, prevention is really important.
But as I'm sure you know, each of these programs has their own sets of terminology, their own techniques, their own ways of communicating this content. So on the one hand, I don't mean to say that they're all just the same. There are perhaps important differences, but at least in terms of the raw content of in these major categories, they are becoming more focused on these prevention and de-escalation components.
Well, that's great. That actually leads into what kind of answers my next question, was that although a lot of these programs refer to prevention or conflict de-escalation components, I mean, one thing that we still fight at CPI quite often in the populations that we train and serve is a perception that we teach restraint or takedown training, and we're really trying to counter that with the preventative aspect of our training and our behavioral models. So do you see evidence that the aspect of prevention, I think you've just said so, that rather than reaction such as restraint is becoming a more prevalent mode of the way people think about challenging behavior?
Yes, I think so. And also, and I'm not aware of how CPI does this, but many of the programs, I think, are trying to train a broader group of educators on the prevention and de-escalation components of the training without all of those educators receiving the other parts of the training, and which are usually reserved for a smaller team of individuals within a school or a program. So I think the broadening of that training to larger audiences, the prevention and de-escalation components, is an extremely valuable and important outcome, and I think many of the programs are trying to do that.
That's a great observation. Thank you. Let's move into something that a lot of we hear about in the news lately, and I think people will know the sound of it, if not the details, and that's the Keeping All Students Safe Act. The Senate bill H.R. 927, which is known as Keeping All Students Safe Act, prohibits schools from using the specific kinds of restraints and seclusion, or specific kinds of restraints and seclusion rather, as well as requiring school staff to be trained in state-approved crisis intervention training. There hasn't been a lot of momentum or action in getting this bill passed. And in your presentation, A Consumer's Guide to Crisis Intervention Training Programs from the Midwest Symposium for Leadership and Behavior Disorders that happened in February of 2016, you indicate that none is likely. In your opinion, is this purely politics before policy?
Yeah, I'm afraid to say, yeah, I think it pretty much is. Right now, our federal government is fairly stagnant and not able to come to consensus on a variety of issues. And also, there is some concern that the federal government should not be engaging in discussions of specific kinds of procedures, policies, and so on for schools, because education and schooling is viewed as a state function rather than a federal government function. So there's all of these kinds of issues that are interfering with the movement forward of bills like that H.R. 927 and some of those bills. None of those bills are currently introduced, so far as I know, in the current Congress. And given the political environment, I don't see them going forward. However, I don't think that ends the initiative, because I think there are still states that are moving forward, and whether or not they have state legislation, there are things that are promoting further work and development and thinking on this topic. A couple things we didn't mention: there was a letter to colleagues that the Office of Civil Rights put forward that basically suggests to schools that they need to be keeping data to show that there is not discrimination in their use of restraint and seclusion with kids with disabilities or minorities. So that is still something, a federal issue that is applying to districts. And things like that. There was also a part of the federal education bill, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which implied that states and districts need to plan on how they're going to diminish the use of aversive procedures, and that specifically included the use of physical restraint and seclusion. So there are these kind of minor pokes to progress, but not in the form of federal legislation. I don't see that coming anytime soon due to the politics.
I see. Now, is it your opinion, both you, Reece and Elizabeth, that crisis intervention training should be required, and if not on a federal level, then at least state approved? Is that something that should be in place?
Yes, I think we both agree that training is useful, and particularly, again, those prevention and de-escalation components should be provided and available. I don't, and some states do approve this type of training, but one of the concerns we have is that there is no oversight body that would accredit training, which means that in addition to the kind of the 17 main vendors that we identified in our study, there are probably all kinds of individuals out there offering training, but we don't know what the content of those training programs are. And this is an area that needs to be addressed.
Yep. Yeah, I totally agree on that. And I think one thing, too, that training should focus on is helping with the fidelity of that implementation in schools, because I think although we are seeing this great focus on prevention and crisis de-escalation, it's still not always translating into the schools, because we definitely are seeing these procedures used as not as last resort procedures. So I think it's important that they have training, and I think that we continue to work on how that training is implemented in the schools with fidelity.
I see. Well, finally today, I guess this is maybe difficult to ask people in academia, but I'm going to. Do you, Reece and Elizabeth, feel optimistic, I guess, that public awareness of the danger of restraint and seclusion in schools is going to translate one day in the not-too-distant future into meaningful policy and legislation on state, if not federal level?
No, I'm hopeful, but so far, at least for, I guess, as we said at the federal level, I'm not sure that that's going to happen. I think, unfortunately, a lot of these policies are reactive to events that occur instead of proactive. So I'm optimistic, but we'll see where that goes.
And I, too, am optimistic that we are continuing as educators nationwide to work on this topic. But my optimism is tempered with a bit of frustration because we continue to see these instances where there is not awareness, not progress, and therefore, as a result, where there's these abusive or injurious conditions that are occurring in schools. So it's kind of a mixed bag, I guess I'd say. I want to keep optimistic, and certainly things are moving forward, but there's also a recognition that there's really serious problems still out there in the schools to be worked on.
And indeed, and well, thank you for those words. And I mean, we see, in Louisiana recently, a bill that is not passed but was put into committee, I believe, about allowing corporal punishment and specific kinds of corporal punishment that included words such as slapping, and sort of a giant step backwards, I think. And so I think we're combating a reactionary sort of political force these days with more progressive ideas that hopefully your journal article and your continuing study and your update will sort of make a roadmap for people to see where the progress is and what's available to schools that want to take a more progressive approach.
Yes, actually, there was a similar bill in Nebraska that was, we think, a step backward this past year. But to me, what that focuses on is the need for better and more mental health services in the schools to address the needs of kids who are having more serious behavior problems. So rather than moving backwards to, these kind of corporal punishment type approaches, I would hope that schools recognize that they need to hire more counselors, bring in expertise to solve these behavior problems rather than waiting until they are a crisis.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, continue to address the underlying reasons for these behavior problems instead of reacting to them.
Well, Reece, you're referring to LB 595, I think, in Nebraska, right? And I think the apparent goal was to reduce violence in schools and to diminish inappropriate behavior. But you write, I believe the action this bill authorizes school administrations and teachers are unlikely to accomplish these goals, rather, and in fact are likely to pose dangers which might be worse than the original problems identified in the bill. Could you talk, how is that such a in these words, a misguided piece of legislation? How is it formed, and why is that true about it, or why is that your as a subject matter expert, your opinion on it?
Well, one thing is, I think permitting teachers to lay their hands on kids poses an inappropriate model for kids, because what it suggests is that problem behaviors can be dealt with force, and in this case, even physical force. And I just think that is inappropriate. I can see where teachers feel they want that because of their frustration with not being able to effectively serve the kids that they're asked to serve. But again, I really think that the solution is to provide better preventative services, positive behavior interventions and supports, for example, in schools has a track record of reducing the kinds of behavior problems, whereas corporal punishment or physical intervention not only doesn't have any evidence to support its effectiveness, but it has the potential to actually damage and destroy relationships with kids. So I think we need to move away from those kind of solutions.
Well said. Thank you. Do you have any last words today, Reece or Elizabeth, that you'd like to offer about restraint and seclusion in schools and crisis intervention as a discipline?
No, except that I hope that the providers of training will continue to be able to work with the schools to show that their content of their training should be more broadly disseminated, again, especially these prevention and de-escalation components. So I would like to see that happen, and that will be helpful to head off some of these bills that we just now discussed that are not going to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, Reece and Elizabeth, Reece Peterson and Elizabeth Kane. They are two subject matter experts in the field of crisis intervention training, both with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Thank you so much today for the interview, Reece and Elizabeth.
Thank you for talking.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us today on Unrestrained. Tune in again soon for another interview with an expert in behavior management. Until then, this is your host, Terry Vittone, hoping your intention is prevention.